All right. Looks like, yes, I don't have to get too close to the microphone. So we're going to get started here. Probably have people straggling in. Good afternoon and welcome to the forestry segment of the Penwar meeting here. And my name is Matt Comisky. I'm the Washington Manager of American Forest Resource Council. You can check my bio on the app to find out what AFRC does, but it's all things timber in 6 Western states related to public timber. So today we have a great group of panelists, but first I'd like to thank Woodlands County for sponsoring this segment of the presentation, and we'll keep on moving here so that since we're a couple minutes behind. But we've seen challenges in the Pacific Northwest, either south or north of the border in the forestry sector, whether that's timber supply, forest health, wildfire, workforce development, and continued loss of the infrastructure, just as seen the Prince George announcement of the pulp mill closure here last week. The Alberta Host Committee sent the group. I'm one of the co-chairs. My other co-chair, Jason Cripps from Alberta Forest Products Association, unfortunately had a conflict. He's in DC. I'm sorry for that. I try to avoid DC as much as I can. But two of the topics were around workforce, wildfire, forest health, and infrastructure. And I thought, what a cool idea to just merge those all two together. So today we're just going to scratch the surface of kind of the interconnectability of the industry, rural communities, and kind of all the things around carbon, forest health, all those things. To really do it justice, we probably need, 3 days? But we're going to cover as much of it in the next about 70 minutes. So first off, I would like to invite Nicole Galambos she's the Director of Science and, oh, wait a minute, I'm reading even the wrong one. Director of Forest Ecology at Alberta Forest Products Association. And one thing before Nicole comes up, because I'm trying to do this very fast, so I'm running. If you have questions, please put them in the app, and I will track them, and we're going to maybe try to do a few questions after each presenter, and then we'll have a longer Q&A session once everybody's done. So thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone. Just wait a moment. Oh, perfect. Technology. So welcome to Alberta. For those of you not from here, a quick little intro. Alberta Forest Products Association is the forest industry association representing all forest industry in Alberta. Our members range from small mom and pop shops to large international corporations working across the lumber, secondary manufacturing, pulp, paper, and panel board sectors. So a little bit of context setting. In Alberta, about 60% of the landmass is forested. They only gave me 3 buttons, and I've already managed to push the wrong one. So high confidence. We have the green as our boreal forest region. That's north of here. You are currently sitting in Edmonton, outside of Alberta's forest area. The purple is our foothills forest region, and the dark purple is into the Rocky Mountains for a little bit of context setting. Every single forest in Alberta is a fire-dependent ecosystem. Naturally, these forests they burned regularly, they burned hot. That created a real mix of young and old forests. That was a mosaic of different age classes, different species compositions. And that allowed all of the species that we all love and care for to grow and flourish in this environment. They were really adapted to this idea of disturbance, post-disturbance, renewal, regeneration, and they in fact require that mix of forest type. But this natural diversity and variation of our landscape is changing, and that's challenging our forests and the resilience of our forestry communities. Anyone in the house live or work in a rural forestry community? Okay, we've got a few. I was having a great conversation with some folks from the Mackenzie County last night about this challenge with perspectives and understanding, like, what is an old forest in Alberta And it's not what you might picture if you're closing your eyes and you're thinking large diameter trees and a moist climate that's in some sort of steady state. It's dying, dead, bug-infested trees or swamps. Because our forests are so ripe and primed to burn, that's what they're used to. So you start to get a tree that's in that 100, 120-year-old range, and that's not a normal age class to have in high proportion across our landscape, but we're starting to see that become more and more regular. And there's really two reasons that disturbance regime is changing, and it's because we're excluding disturbance. Alberta is hands down a fire engine. We have an excellent fire suppression program in the province. I think the provincial target is to have 95% of every wildfire out or under control within a day. So obviously, we're protecting human life, we're protecting communities, we need that, but that is impacting our natural forest. The second thing working around disturbance removal is this idealized concept or preservation mindset that we can, in fact, put a bubble over a thing we value and preserve and protect it for all eternity. So it's just a really interesting juxtaposition here in Alberta. We've got some work done on what a natural fire cycle would look like, so pre-industrial disturbance. Again, 3 buttons, and I can't figure it out. Outside of the fire region, we would have fire repeatedly in our grasslands every 10 to 30 years. As you move into the boreal forests and our foothills, that fire cycle of fire returning and burning over the landscape would be about 65 to maybe 100 or 120 years old. So this idea of frequent and regular fire in our pre-industrial landscapes is the ecological reality. But we have a long history of fire suppression as well, going back to the 1950s. 1832 was when things started. In the 1950s, with aerial suppression, a policy change to move to landscape level wildfire response occurred. The government of Alberta doubled down on some of that policy around having less than 0.1% of the forest landscape burned per year. So that idea of eradicating disturbance is baked into policy. But we need wildfire suppression. Nobody's arguing the fact that our rural communities, human life values need protecting. So we were finding a balance where we could replace and mimic natural fire disturbance with industrial forestry. So through our management actions, we could create a disturbance, a post-disturbance renewal, and try to get to that natural balance of that mix of young and old forests to provide for the biodiversity that all of our species need. We've done a lot of studies, collected all kinds of data in the decades since industrial forestry arrived on the landscape, that convergence theory that a wildfire can in fact mimic natural disturbance is demonstrated in science, and our members have been working really hard to make sure that our practices are sustainable and our resources, forestry resources, are there to provide for all of the values that our communities, Indigenous partners, and wildlife need. But it's becoming more and more challenging to practice forestry on our landscape because of the second policy and political public driver. I've got here 3 maps of areas in our province that are becoming off limits for commercial forestry. So if you remember, did it again? This is our forest area of commercial forestry. The green is our national and provincial parks where commercial forestry is not permitted. The middle map shows some federal targets around managing for caribou, a species at risk, where the federal targets are to have all these polygons, 35% or less disturbance. So trying to create unnaturally high percentages of old forests. And in the areas where we don't have national parks or protection for caribou, a species at risk, we're starting to see in the foothills The same idea of disturbance to manage another species at risk of cold water trout start to appear on the landscape. So if you squint your eyes and try to imagine all those three maps overlaying, there's large geographic portions of our forest land base that is becoming fiber constrained due to policy. And so I would, suggest that we've changed and altered our natural forests to protect people, but this is having consequences, particularly when paired with policies that are trying to preserve the currently unnaturally old forest state. But I don't know that we've really stopped and thought about the consequences of that. I know in the name of caribou conservation, we've dramatically changed some of our forests. This is some work done by FRI Research looking at historically what would the natural range of variation of our forests be in all the different caribou zones. So the green bars are the quartiles, the red dots are the current reality. So we would have naturally had a lot more young forests than we currently do. And we would not nearly have as much old forest as we currently do. But because we're managing by policy to this unnatural state, we really are elevating the amount of old forest that we've got in some places. And so what's that doing? Well, that's creating an opportunity for insect infestation. This is a map showing the massive expansion of mountain pine beetle from BC into Alberta in the last couple of decades. They're following the food. We're also seeing wildfire hazard continue to escalate. This is some work done by Dr. Jen Beverly at the University of Alberta, who's been studying landscape level wildfire ignition exposure or hazard. So the red is high hazard, the blue is low hazard, and from 2007 to 19, I think everyone can see the amount of red showing up on that map. These old forests are ripe and primed to burn, and that's showing up at a landscape level hazard assessment. That's also showing up in our trends of area burned. Again, stolen from Dr. Beverly, some trends going back over the years. We used to see occasional spikes in area burned, in came aerial fire suppression, and then we started to see these really regular spikes in fire activity making the news all over the place. This map truncates in 2023. I assure you 2024 was at this same yellow bar level with 700,000 hectares, which is 1.7 million acres, burned, similar for 2025. And we've all been looking at the news the last few days. And I can tell you as a fire behavior analyst, there are three things that influence wildfire behavior. It's your weather, it's your topography, it's your forest fuels. I'm not sure we can do much about weather and topography, so that leaves us as managers looking at forest fuel management if, as society, we're seeing concerns and trends with this wildfire hazard. I just wanted to throw up this map again. It's this idea of preserving and protecting. This is a couple of caribou ranges in Alberta, west and north of here, where industrial activity has been excluded, contrasted with a managed landscape overlaying Dr. Beverly's hazard exposure. We can refer to this scientifically as a big red blob. So as as managers, that should be concerning. And we're seeing what happens when fire runs through those big red blobs. Those fires burn hot. There's not a natural mosaic and break of the landscape, so it's difficult to control or suppress those fires once they get up and going. And they're threatening some of the very things that we're trying to preserve and protect through this, this method of putting a bubble over things. So in Alberta, we value our forests. We want to have healthy forests. We need to have healthy rural forest communities through time. But it's really becoming a challenge to manage in the policy environment. We're seeing large fires, more frequent and extreme events, threatening some of the things that we value, and that rural way of life. our social, our recreational, our Indigenous and cultural values are all being impacted. We have seen our national parks in Canada start to become net emitters or sources of carbon, but I'm going to leave that to Kent and Elaine to really unpack. We've also seen impacts in our rural forest communities. Those communities are regularly put on evacuation alert or being evacuated. And we really worry that without a healthy and vibrant forest economy and industry, that we're going to enter a cycle of negative feedback where you're constrained and you don't have access to fiber by policy. So you pull back as an industry. But now that forest is aging, it's becoming old, it's susceptible to wildfire. You're going to get a wildfire, you're going to have less fiber, your industry pulls back. And at some point in time, that might not be sustainable for an industry. And I don't know what happens when an industry leaves a community in Alberta. Right now, when the Wildfire Agency wants to suppress a wildfire, they're calling our members. We supply all of the heavy equipment and contractors to provide that wildfire suppression response. So when we're not there and we're not active on the landscape, we start losing that suppression engine as well. So there's a lot of things that we could unpack. And I certainly don't want to end things with like a doom and gloom type of attitude or feeling in the room, because we have management approaches and policy that we can make to ensure the long-term health of our forests and our forest communities. And I really look forward to getting a chance to discuss some of that as the panel, because we do have options to use forestry to cool the landscape, to tame the flames, and support the resilience of our forest industry and forest communities. So thanks, Matt.
All right, thank you, Nicole. In the interest of time, we're going to keep rolling and we'll handle questions kind of towards the end. Next up is Kent Wheiler. He is the director for the Center for International Trade and Forest Products, housed at the University of Washington. Go Huskies. Happen to be one, so.
Thanks, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm at the Center for International Trade and Forest Products at the University of Washington. I was in the industry most of my career. No one cared that I had a PhD until 10 years ago. The university called me in. So I said, yeah, cool. So I love it there. What happened here? There we go. I'm not touching anything on this. Are you guys doing that back there? All right, here we go. Okay, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed in 1988. So at the time they put out this statement, they'd been studying climate change for 30 years. And you all know United Nations, they put out a lot of paper, and I imagine their studies would stretch from here to the moon. And after 30 years, they came out with this statement, which I think is super significant. In the long term, a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest carbon stocks while producing a yield of timber will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. So the thing we can do that will have the most impact on climate change mitigation is grow more trees because they absorb carbon, and then use more wood products because the carbon is stored in those wood products, and then we grow more trees. Okay, so there's quite a bit of evidence that sustainable forestry addresses climate change, and when we manage our forests sustainably, we can have a positive impact. At the University of Washington, this Sankey diagram is don't get too worried about how it may look complex, but what you want to look at here, this is data we did. This is a diagram we created based on FIA data, which is forest inventory analysis data put out by U.S. Forest Service. It's real data. It's not based on modeling. So the problem that we often have is scientists can make models and they make assumptions for those models, right? And depending on what those assumptions are, will affect the model outcomes. This is not based on modeling. This is based on real data from the U.S. Forest Service, okay? And what it says here is on Washington State corporate forests, we're getting about 4.93 tons of carbon absorbed with the growth of those forests per acre. So hectare multiply by 2.47 and per year, okay? So the growth here is 4.93 and then 2.4, so 3.87 of it gets harvested. 2.44 of that ends up in wood products. 1.42 is lost through mortality and 0.34 is forest biomass increase. So there is more left after the whole cycle. It's still increasing every year. We're still increasing forest growth. Okay, so that's corporate. Whoa, why did this? Okay, so this is Washington DNR, and in Washington and Oregon, both states manage quite a large amount of timberland. And here's what you see from Washington State: 4.09 in growth, 1.59 in products, 1.79 in mortality, and 0.24 in biomass increase. Pretty similar to corporate, not as high of numbers as you'd expect because corporations are growing for growth and they're aggressively trying to grow the trees. And DNR's almost like, I mean, they're growing for growth and harvest, but not quite as aggressively as corporate. Okay, so then what do we see in federal forests? This is a chart of harvests of federal forest lands, that's U.S. forest lands in Washington State. And notice here about 19, it's not, I don't have a quite good view of it, but that peak there is right at the end of the 80s and the start of the 90s. And that was the spotted owl legislation that cut off, said we have to protect habitats for spotted owls. And basically at that point, U.S. forest lands gradually, or not gradually, very rapidly began to be unmanaged. And we're not harvesting almost anything off U.S. forest lands now. And it's been 30 years. So the data I'm showing you has that 30 years built into it and the result we're seeing. And if you've been in Washington State forests, you will see scenes like this. This is federal forest land. It was harvested at one point, replanted for regrowth, and with the expectation that you were going to do a couple thinnings and then harvest after 40 years or so. That didn't happen. And so what's happened now is you've just got, look at this stump. That's the stump from the prior growth. And then it's just dominated by small diameter trees closely packed together. It's a very unhealthy forest. You fly over it, it looks like this nice green carpet, but it's not healthy. It's not a good forest. And then look at all the fall down. And when we have a fire, is it any wonder? I mean, Nicole talked about fuel load. These have enormous fuel load. Look at this fuel load in here. And these are pictures I just took. I just got out of my car and stood by the road and took the picture. So you've got thousands and thousands of acres of this. So here's what the federal picture looks like. Much less growth because we're not managing it. And then almost most of that, 70% of it, so it's 40% less growth and 70% of it's being lost to mortality, fire, and so on. We are getting a more biomass increase on our federal forests, but it's not healthy, and we're losing almost everything in biomass. So the net result of all this, I'll let you read that, but the net result is that for carbon mitigation, considering that alone, we're much better off with the corporate and the state managed forests trying to produce forest products than we're getting a result by not doing anything on our federal forests. And now, so here is what's happening in Washington State timber harvest. And here is that path I showed earlier of the federal forest. And look how much bigger scale corporate forestry is. And what puzzles me, it doesn't puzzle me, I know what's going on, but it's just frustrating, is that despite all this that we know about the benefits of managing our forests, even corporate forest harvesting is declining every year. That's having an impact on, of course, production, because we're not harvesting, we can't produce as much. The blue line is lumber production in the Pacific Northwest. The orange line is lumber production in the US South. And pre-1990, the Pacific Northwest was always above the South. And then for about a 10, 20-year period there, they were almost the same. But since the housing crisis and the Great Recession in 2008, the Pacific Northwest production has continued to drop, or it's not, it went up, but it's just struggling. It's not doing well. It's never got back to this level, and the South has continued to grow. That's, of course, having an impact on our exports. Washington State used to be one of the biggest lumber exporters. It's no longer. It's declining every year. And I think this is my last slide. And I think it tells a sad story here, because this is Japan's imports of softwood lumber. And if you look here, this is the US, this is Canada. At one point between the two countries, North America, we controlled 85% of the market in Japan. And now the US is a non-player, and Canada is down to 20, 25%. And Europe has really filled that gap. And this is an issue of our own making. We made decisions that resulted in this. The region could be one of the most productive, sustainably managed forest lands in the world, and we're not because of decisions we make. So my question, what the hell are we doing? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kent. Next up, we have Dr. Elaine Oneil, who is the Director of Science at CORRIM, and I'm not even going to try to break out what CORRIM stands for.
Thanks, Matt. CORRIM, Consortium for Research on Renewable Industrial Materials. Who would make up a name like that? My boss did in 1996, but he was playing off of a 1976 report that was looking at the environmental performance of wood. And so he kept the same acronym, changed it a little bit. It's 20 research institutions scattered across the US and a couple in Canada that have been looking at environmental performance of wood for 30 years this past June. So we've talked about the impacts of fire, insects, and disease with Nicole's presentation, and about climate solutions linked to managed forests. And so what I wanted to do was build off of that question that Kent just asked. What are we doing? And the way that I'm going to frame this is build on some, provide some key data and insights to help the policy and legislative folks in the audience here kind of understand some of the competing narratives that you're repeatedly bombarded with. This protect and set aside versus, let's manage it. To help you understand how that framing is developed and maybe give you some talking points to address it. I'm going to start with some data. I think Kent introduced you to the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis data. The U.S. Forest Service has been collecting data on federal lands since the early 1950s. So we have a 70-year record. They report it out every decade. So our next report out is in 2027, and we're going to get some real surprises, I think. I'm showing here two areas. I'm going to focus mostly on the Northwest, but not exclusively. And there are some stories there. So what this should tell you, two takeaways. Our forest acreage hasn't changed much. And over the past 70 years, when we've moved from a so-called harvesting old growth to harvesting second growth, our inventory hasn't changed much either. There's a little bit of a bump up there with the increase, the change when the spotted owl took effect on our federal lands. But by and large, it's pretty stable. In other words, we're growing what we're harvesting. There's some management is working in these systems. Now I want to add a little bit of a twist in there. I added in the Southeast region, think Alabama, Georgia, that area is the Southeast. Quite a few more acres down there of forest land, and see that significant increase that they have from the 40s to the 2017 reporting period. Part of that is that they started from, rebuilding from abandoned agricultural land. Part of it was a significant investment in improving silviculture and improving growth at the same time that they're really improving harvesting. So the public policy in the Southeast is quite different than it is here in the Pacific Northwest in terms of regulation. And so we've heard that theme all day, this idea of regulation is it puts a damper on growth and production. And supposedly the idea is that it's to protect our nature, but here we're seeing that there's maybe some issues associated with that. Now, again, on this, I want to call your attention to the difference between the coastal, think of that temperate rainforest, big Doug fir, the standing inventory on that versus the inland west, which is basically everything east of the Cascades, and just how much wood we can produce on the West Coast per acre. It's really stunning. And the reason for that really is because we can grow big trees in a very short period of time. For perspective, the picture on the left, that's a 60-year-old Douglas fir. That guy's 6'5", so it's not exactly a tiny little tree. Too big for our infrastructure. We can't actually mill that wood here. Most of it, that would be what he called a China log if we still exported to China. And then on the right is a 33-year-old redwood, which was planted on spec or probably for fun on a private forest landowner in Washington. Again, probably not millable with our current infrastructure. The people love these big trees, and not just the landowners, also everybody else. And so that builds us to this development of this competing narrative. And I think in most jurisdictions in the Pacific Northwest region, we have what I call the locker up folks. Everyone has their local entity that's concerned about that. In our case in Washington, we have the Center for Responsible Forestry, and they're one of the drivers. There are others, but really their narrative is that the best way to store carbon is to leave those forests alone. We've heard that sort of preservation angle for a lot of different reasons. Now they're using carbon as the reason why you would want to do that now. And it has a bunch of presumptions tied into it. And I want to go through those and give you some data that helps you understand those presumptions and how you might want to respond to them. The first presumption they have is that, especially in these wet or west side forests, that they grow indefinitely and they never die. Now, Kent talked a little bit about this mortality versus reality. And one of the things that are our cohort of lock 'em up for folks are is, they don't really like the science that Kent showed, and they certainly don't like the life cycle analysis work that CORRIM has done, but they do like this World Resources Institute model, which is, if you can see these red dots, this is age up to 120, and this is metric tons of heart. So the little red dots is the predicted growth from this model. And when they put that on a global scale, they say, well, actually, forestry does not store more carbon than just leaving the forest grow. The reality is, if you look at inventory in that same area, is this little box and what we call box and whiskers. So the box is basically, if you think about a growth curve, the 25th and 75th percentile. In other words, 50% of your stuff is in that box. And then you have an upper and lower bound, which is the little whisker. That's the box and whisker. Here's the model, the dream. Here's the reality. What that helps us understand is that a model is not reality. So when we're faced with this idea that the best thing to do is leave it alone, you have to ask, where are you getting your information? Now, some of these same entities also say, well, if we just grow it longer than 120 years, and this ties into what Nicole was saying, we would get to be able to see that old growth of old. We want to be able to have these big, magnificent trees. So this is data from, this is Washington State old growth. Well, this is unmanaged federal lands. And so again, oops. Hey, Nicole, I did the same thing you did. Congratulations. So this is decades through time. So this is basically anywhere from here on would be considered old growth. And you'll see that even though it's a little bit jaggedy because there's not very many plots in there, you kind of top out at 80 years. Even in that coastal temperate rainforest, everything has a carrying capacity, whether it's a forest, whether it's an ag field, whether you're growing, animal unit months, or bushels of corn, or cubic meters of wood, there's a carrying capacity. Now, this is just Washington State. So I have well, I'll get to that, sorry. Now, one of the reasons for that flattening out is that forest mortality starts to kick in. And we've talked a little bit about that. And in this particular chart, which we put together when we looked at the Trillion Tree Initiative, you'll start to see what that looks like, not just in Washington State, which Kent talked about, but sort of in the whole pinware footprint on unmanaged national forests. Because what you'll see here is starting, this was the harvest, and this is when it tanked when we had the spotted owl. And we did see a little bit of increase in net growth after that period. And then starting in about 2000, net growth tanked because mortality took off. This is just up to 2017 data, because remember, it's reported on a 10-year, on a decadal interval. So this is really, we've had a natural experiment of 35 years of setting it aside across this 7-state region. What happens to the forests? Well, they're dying from insect and disease, and they're burning up. There's a reason we have smoke everywhere. So the point I'm making about that is that these things are they're in a dynamic cycle. They work, and you can't really put a stall on that no matter how much we want to. Now, we also have a new term to contend with. I don't know if this is everywhere, but it's certainly in Washington State, this idea of we want to preserve all our legacy forests. Well, what are they? They're anything that wasn't planted and it's like over 70 years old. The idea being that we take those big trees and they're going to become those forests of old. For people here, well, I don't know that you have any really big trees in Alberta, But if you're in BC, think of, the Cathedral Grove outside of Nanaimo, or the Walbrand, or the Cormana, or any other of those forests that we've been fighting about for the past 40 years. Think about the California redwoods. The vision is, if we just leave it long enough, they will turn into these magnificent old forests. Well, I hate to break it to you, but this is that map again, where the green is this green here is the same thing you just saw, which was Washington State's unmanaged lands. And then these two dots are from British Columbia old growth study. And they looked at all of the old growth stands. There was like 140 of them or something, 146. Including ones that had quite a bit of mortality, and then the ones that were fully stocked. Okay, so this is kind of your carrying capacity. Now, there are also a couple of extraordinary stands. This one is reported out. This is H.J. Andrews down in southern Oregon. Extraordinary stand. Now, in the U.S., I call that the Tiger Woods of forest carbon storage. The rest of us can play golf, but that doesn't mean we're any good. Tiger Woods is amazing. But, we're in the room of the great one. So this is the Wayne Gretzky of forest carbon storage. I know he's called the great one. So we got the Wayne Gretzky of forest carbon storage. They exist, but they're not common, which is why, they all get paid so much money. Now, the Wayne Gretzky of forest, that particular plot, I've actually visited it. It's the H.J. Andrews. Now, when I was there, it had some wind damage, which is why those big logs were cut. But in 2023, 2/3 of it burned. 25,000 acres went up in one wildfire. Even those extraordinary Wayne Gretzky forests do not last forever in that wetter west side, which has irregular fires. The other thing that the Lock It Up folks don't like is that they assert that the carbon footprint story of wood products is overstated or it's a fiction. Well, this gets my blood boiling because this is the work I've been doing for the past 20 years. And so I've been actually doing the forest product or the forestry side of the life cycle assessment for 20 years, but the CORRIM, the research consortium, 30 years we've been doing this life cycle assessment research to international standards. And it's 20 institutions. You can't actually get them to collude on anything. And we take all of that data, thousands and thousands of pages, and we boil it down into these things called environmental product declarations that are used in the architecture, engineering, and construction world to understand the environmental footprint of wood. I would say we know wood, and we know what the footprint of wood is, and it looks pretty good. Now, this is where the wood is good stuff comes from. We didn't coin that. We just provided the data, and somebody else said, you mean wood is good? And I said, sure, if you want, but here's the data. A couple of years ago, we were actually asked to expand that idea. Instead of just looking at the left-hand side of this chart, where we're measuring all these things, emissions to air, land, and water, to come up with that footprint, to say, well, what happens if you don't harvest? Because on its surface, if you just look at this little picture, clearly there are more emissions from growing and harvesting trees than if you just left those trees alone. Well, that's true. You can't argue that. The problem with that argument is that emissions only matter if you're all worried about climate change and carbon emit. It's what the atmosphere sees, not what the forest sees. So you have to expand the system, and you have to see what happens to all of these things that don't happen in the forest. Does the forest actually keep growing? What do we do if we don't harvest? And then the point about forest actually keeping growing. No, it doesn't. We have established we have a carrying capacity. And what happens in the real world is if you don't harvest, you either build with alternatives to wood, carbon or steel, for example, or you harvest somewhere else. So that somewhere else, if you're in the carbon market world, is called leakage. I'm not going to harvest here, I'm going to harvest somewhere else. If I take and set aside areas that produce, I don't know, 500 cubic meters per hectare at 40 years, and I said, well, I'm going to substitute that with something that produces 250 cubic meters per hectare that takes 80 years. Well, I've just done a 4-for-1 swap there and not in the right direction. So when we did that analysis, we actually figured out with the particular example that we used that, in fact, the lock it up scenario generated more carbon emissions, in other words, stored less carbon out of the atmosphere than the managed system for that particular example. The other thing that we have with the lock it up and then sell carbon credits, because that's the next iteration of this, is that there's a lot of requirements for things like carbon markets. This real monster called additionality. They have to address reversals, so that mortality and removals. They have to address leakage. So recently, I mean, this spring, the Washington Climate Commitment Act, they have this protocol and they had this agreement. They were working on linkages between California and Quebec. And they decided that their mortality and risk buffer pool would have to be up to 30%. In other words, you would have to, if you had 100 credits, 30 of them would have to be set aside. You couldn't sell them because there would potential for mortality. And then they said, well, leakage is a real thing, so we're going to have to set aside 40 credits for that. So now your 100 credits is, you got 30 credits to sell. Ask yourself the question, who's going to invest in something that already has a 70% tax? Is any producer going to think that that's a good idea? Well, some do, sort of as a one-off deal. But you can see that this is something that has some real challenges from an economic perspective. And so I want to finish up on a couple of other things here. So on the economic side, this idea of, that people want to use that as a sop to local communities if they can't harvest. But now you have to start thinking about it a little bit differently. How do we position wood from working forest as a way to meet these multiple challenges facing our region? And I think one of the things we're going to have to acknowledge is this not in my backyard mentality, something I call environmental imperialism. We just get our stuff from somewhere else and we can enjoy all this beauty, and it's not going to change. We have to push back on that. We have to insert some reality into that. And we have to challenge it because it not only exports radiant, healthy forests, it exports our jobs and rural economic vitality. In Washington State, we're starting to look at that even through this lens of environmental justice, because poverty is part of environmental justice, and a lot of our rural areas are suffering from policy decisions that have shut down their economic engines. And finally, I think on a positive note, what we need to be thinking about is how to link the work that we do in forests and the products that we produce to our health and to forest health. We can't really have healthy communities or forests without rebuilding our connection, the connection between humans and forests, so that they feel like they're a part of them, not apart from them. That's the norm. We don't really see ourselves as a part of forests, so we want to hold them out there as something sacred and protected, instead of seeing ourselves as part of something that's really dynamic that we can work with. And that's going to take, I think, a sea change in the efforts of leaders who say, I want to embody that. I want to, help spread that message as part of the narrative. And I probably went terribly over.
I was about to give you the hook, but I saw the last slide.
I knew I would go over. Okay, I'm done.
All right. So thank you to all three of the panelists. I've been fortunate to see most all of those presentations previously, and actually analyze some of the data for some of my normal work. I will note. So there's a few questions in the app that I'm going to pull from. There's one that I'm going to leave to last because if you know me, which most of you in the room don't, I'm very well known in the policy world in Washington for around forestry of just stating it like it is, to the point to where I speak at the Olympic Logging Conference held in Victoria almost every year. It's the longest running non-Canadian conference held in Canada. Happens every April. A little shameless plug there, but I was known for providing a lot of data. And one attendee said, Matt, you should put up the suicide prevention line number at the end of your presentation. So normally I now have a slide in my presentations that says dial 1-800-GET-A-HUG when I'm done. So I'm going to save the more positive question for the end so I don't end with dial 1-800-GET-A-HUG. So, you know, a couple questions here. Let's see. Actually, I'm going to start with one since Elaine just went. It says, has your science and counter arguments gotten traction with policy and decision makers?
I think. How about that? Okay. Sometimes. I think if nothing else, what it's done is inserted a level of uncertainty into their decision-making process, because they're going down the road of, I mean, let me just back up on that. Who in an elected position can withstand the continuous onslaught of people beating on them to do a particular thing? It's very, very difficult for people to stand up and say, actually, your argument doesn't hold water. Because most electeds, it's like they know an inch deep and a mile wide of everything, but they don't know the deep data that I know. So what I try to do is provide that information for them. So when somebody comes into their office and says, you know, the sky is falling, we need to do something about it, they actually have a data point that they can argue with. Does that change the nexus of how they vote? I don't know. I'm not in their head.
I mean, yeah, I would say, you know, from my perspective, I get to spend a lot of time with legislators. I think a lot of this actually is, at least in Washington, starting to gain a little bit of traction. We actually have in the Washington State Legislature, the chair of the House Ag and Natural Resources Committee. She will describe herself as a urban soccer mom from Federal Way, which is part of the big Seattle, Tacoma, Everett urban core. And she gets this stuff and is really diving into it and understanding the negative impacts of walking away from our forest, not only on the ecological side of it, but also on the socioeconomic side of it. So I think some of Elaine's stuff is getting traction in Washington, a little bit of it in DC, but Washington's still an interesting place to work. And from my other colleagues in Oregon and Idaho and Montana, you know, it is, but it's, you know, there's a big bankroll of folks that are advocating for the lock it up side of the world. So
I just want to add one more piece on this, because, you know, you never let a good crisis go to waste, right? A good crisis go to waste. The fact that the East Coast is being smoked out may actually give us more traction than we know. I mean, it's really unfortunate that we have these awful wildfires out east and it's smoking out major centers, but that may actually provide the narrative, because some of our areas have that kind of air quality all summer, every summer for the past 15 years. And now it's like, now we can have a national conversation.
Just add. This thing is on. Okay. The other room, it was like, just keep talking. I think we provide an alternate narrative that is resonating with policymakers. I think there's a lot of misinformation in the lock it up crowd that is maybe pervasive through some of our policy institutions and government staff. So providing the science and data that tells that alternative narrative is resonating. I think we are seeing that that is having an impact, positive.
This crowd is representative of that issue. Is this working now? 611 people here, about 5% of you are here. Thank you for coming. But forestry, forest products just isn't something that most people deal with. And most of us were raised in a period where every time something was promoted, it was how many trees it saved. And so there's this mentality that we have to save trees. And I get that legislators have to respond to their voters, but the forest products industry, we have a difficult PR task in front of us.
Let's see. I'm going to grab another one here. How much influence does an efficient supply chain transportation system play into harvesting forests? Do certain areas become uneconomic if rail or trucking isn't reasonably available?
I can start with that. Absolutely. Transportation costs are a major consideration. Every jurisdiction is different. In Alberta, we do have some allowances for a cost factor that influences the price of lumber, but that is absolutely something that folks are looking at as they're making their harvest decisions. And I would suggest, as we want to move maybe into more active management of the forest for wildfire mitigation or others, that might become a constraint.
One of the speakers this morning talked about in petroleum and energy, how all these little things accumulate the impact. And we see the same thing. That's why corporate industrial harvests are dropping in Washington State. It's because we say, oh, your buffer zones have to be around streams, have to be a little bit bigger, or we got to protect the marbled murrelet, or we have to do this or this. And all those little things sound good, particularly to voters, but the cumulative impact is difficult. And if a mill if 20% or 30% of its supply gets cut off because of those different things, what capacity can you continue to operate profitably? And so eventually those mills go out. And that's why transportation, we have a lot of areas where we should harvest, but there's no mill within economic haul distance.
Yeah, I think that's a critical thing. Is not only is it the transportation system, all the new mills that we've seen built, which is very few in Washington and Oregon recently over the last couple decades, have access to rail and close to the I-5 corridor. So those that were traditionally out in your very, very rural parts of the state, we're not seeing that type of infrastructure come back.
And they're also concentrated where there's a lot of private forest land and far less public land. There's basically the infrastructure in areas dominated by public lands has disappeared. So now you have all these wildfires and all this idea of we're going to do all this thinning, and it's like, well, where are you going to send the wood? So we've hoisted our own petard.
Yeah, which is really I would say my point of trying to bring this panel together was really more of sounding the alarm calls. We've seen down in the state, specifically in Washington, Oregon, 30 years of an experiment called the Northwest Forest Plan that I would argue has failed. And then as you continue to look around states of Colorado, Wyoming, their forest health issues with no infrastructure left to treat those, the conversations the Nature Conservancies brought me into around the north central Washington area with no infrastructure, and how we treat federal forests that are at high risk of wildfire. There's example after example, and if we don't start paying attention to it, we'll be here having another conversation. Well, we won't be, but somebody will be in 20 years saying, what happened? We'll be back to that slide of yours, Kent. I'm going to toss this one out here, and whoever wants to grab it. Replacing natural forest areas with monoculture does have a downside. What is the industry doing to create a more natural, biodiverse reforestation policy?
I could start from Alberta context. Well, laughter stifled. So certainly that's all established and set by policy by the government of Alberta. We operate pretty much exclusively on Crown land. I think that plays to this complete misconception and the misinformation that maybe we have all learned as children, that monocultures and this idea of like crop growing is not what we do in our natural forests. In Alberta, we don't cut squares and rectangles. We emulate fire-size patterns with retention patches. We collect seed from the area. We grow that seed and redistribute it to the seed zones that are set. So it's not a monoculture. The government has established retention targets, stocking targets, species, age class distribution targets. We're monitored, we report. So I think that question is maybe rooted in some of the misinformation that we aren't out there creating monocultures.
Let me put a little finer, add some additional context there. In Washington State, we have about 22 million acres of forest land, and over 50% of it is set aside for other purposes, half of it. The other half gets managed either intensively by corporate interests or less intensively by small private. The DNR does a little bit of management on their property. And even in those instances where we're trying to manage intensively to create a plantation, good luck with that. You're dealing with nature. You don't get monocultures. You get what you planted and then all the extra stuff, whatever else comes in. And that can be a lot of different things, particularly if you're dealing with challenges like root rot pockets, et cetera. I think that there are a lot of instances where we have what I'm going to call natural monocultures. You try looking, just back up a little bit. In my early era, I was a timber cruiser in northern BC. We looked at a lot of fire origin stands. They were pretty much monocultures of lodgepole pine because that's what came back after the fire. And by the same token, people say, well, when you cut that down, you should plant a mix. Well, maybe you can't because lodgepole is the best suited species for this area that's been burned multiple times, and nothing else is really going to grow very well. So I think, that's the science mind in me talking about that. But the reality is, as hard as we try, we can't actually get to monoculture. And we have all this other protected area that adds a bunch of that diversity.
So I'm going to stick up for monoculture. That is the number one complaint of my students. The one thing they always bring up is they'll say, well, what about monoculture? It's become a word that's the horror word that scares, that everybody's like, oh, you can't do that because it's a monoculture. And the point I try to help them understand is, okay, we have a lot of forest, like Elaine said, and a lot of it is set aside and natural and preserved and conserved. We also need farms. We need tree farms. And I personally don't see a problem with having a tree farm that's a monoculture. We have corn that's a monoculture. We have wheat that's a monoculture. We have crops that are monocultures. Trees can be a monoculture and be farmed sustainably to provide us with the wood that we need.
All right, I'm going to try to squeeze in 3 more questions. One of them is I'm going to answer, and it's going to be really short. So our forests are going up in smoke. Speak to the opportunity for co-fired and cogen electricity generation by burning biomass.
Can you afford to do it? That's the comment there. Remember, you have to pull this stuff from some area. Do you have the infrastructure to get it in? Do you have the equipment to harvest it, the people to harvest it, the hauling infrastructure to get it to a facility? And do you have the facility?
I would suggest that if you did a full economic analysis, like the cost of wildfire suppression, the health impacts from smoke, the mental and other costs of evacuation, that it is probably the right thing to do, but we don't have the market set up, like who's paying and who's benefiting. There's a mismatch there. So absolutely, that is a model that we probably need to move to, but it's going to take money to incentivize. It's going to take somebody to pay, and it's probably going to be a provincial government if you're in Alberta, because all of society is benefiting from those impacts. But there's probably going to be pressure to just have the forest industry do it as part of your regular business, and we can't afford it. But I think it's, from economic perspective, makes a lot of sense, but we don't have the current market in place to get there.
Yeah, I would agree. I know in Washington, I've looked into it, talked to a couple of business analysts, and hydropower eats our lunch. It's just is the reality is that we can't, economically, it doesn't pay. So the real quick question in the US, how do we deal with the Equal Access to Justice Act that is abused by the environmental for-profit nonprofits to stop management on state and federal lands? The shorter answer is we don't deal with it, although there is interest in doing it. So now to the final question. No, that was not going to, that would need the 1-800 dial a hug slide. Healthy forests need healthy communities. From your perspective, what is the single most important policy change governments could make to improve investment certainty for the forest sector while supporting the long-term sustainability of forest-dependent communities?
I will say U.S. Forest Service needs to start giving out 30-year contracts, which I don't think they will, but you need that kind of 20-year, 30-year certainty, or nobody's going to invest $150 million in a sawmill.
I would suggest, and it was very similar to your cumulative effects comment from earlier, like a full policy review of what is the impact of all of these paper cuts, and putting a baseline right now, because we have this artificially old forest that's seen as normal and natural and is seen as the baseline, but bring it back to the reality of what is that baseline we would have naturally expected, and make all policy decisions from there.
Elaine, anything final?
Oh, they're better than.
Okay. So in the interest of time, any last minute words from any of the three of our panelists? Any call to action?
I'll put a plug in for a documentary called BC is Burning. If anybody hasn't seen it, it's on YouTube. BC is Burning.
So since we're putting plugs in, Richard Attenborough did a documentary about wood use and timber, and it's really, really good. Google Richard Attenborough's forest farms.
All right. Well, with that, I'd like to once again, thank Woodlands County for sponsoring this segment. They do have a booth out there. Go visit if you get a chance. And if I didn't get to your questions, my apologies. Like I said, we could have probably used 3, 4, 5 hours, maybe a couple days for this topic. But hopefully this drew some thoughts out and got the creative juices going. And please, look forward, engage, support your forest sector. It is important to the overall, I would argue, health of the world. Thank you.